Ladies and gentlemen, let's cut through the nonsense. For years, we've been told that the relationship between the United States and India was unbreakable, a glowing example of shared values and strategic partnership. But peel back the glossy headlines and you'll find a story far more raw, far more revealing, a story that has shaken the very foundation of this alliance. And it all comes down to one man, one Indian who had the audacity, the conviction, and yes, the sheer guts to stare down America and say no more. For decades, Washington believed it could set the rules, pull the strings, and dictate to others how the game should be played. India, they thought, would bend like so many before. But this time they got it spectacularly wrong. Because the man they were dealing with wasn't interested in bowing, wasn't interested in begging, and certainly wasn't interested in being America's puppet. He played his own game, and in doing so, he exposed the brutal truth about US-India relations. The truth is this: what was dressed up as partnership was in reality exploitation. Trade deals tilted one way, military expectations piled high, and constant lectures on democracy and freedom while America itself stumbled. It was arrogance at its worst, and when the Indian side finally pushed back, when they finally called out the hypocrisy, Washington didn't just lose face, it lost control. And here's where it gets even more damning. This wasn't just a diplomatic spat. This was a thunderclap heard across the globe. Other nations watched closely. They saw that America, once the undisputed superpower, could be challenged, even humiliated. They saw that India wasn't just another junior partner, but a power in its own right, and the balance began to shift away from Washington's grip towards a new multipolar reality. This wasn't supposed to happen. The US never imagined that its closest ally in the region would dare to tear away the mask and expose the raw truth. But that's exactly what happened. One Indian, one moment, one bold stand, and suddenly the facade crumbled. So let's stop pretending. The US-India relationship is no longer what the White House spin doctors want you to believe. It's fractured, it's exposed, and it's a reminder to America that the days of dictating terms are over. And here's the final point, and it's the one that will sting the most. The truth has power, and once spoken aloud, it can't be silenced. One man proved that. He destroyed the illusion, shattered the old script, and revealed a reality that Washington never wanted the world to see. The US thought it could tame India. Instead, it was India, through one man's defiance, that tamed America. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the real truth. For years, people have been spoon-fed this romanticized notion of a golden friendship between the United States and India, a so-called strategic partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and shared democratic ideals. But let's be brutally honest, that image was always more glossy propaganda than genuine reality. Scratch beneath the surface and the cracks were glaring, even if politicians and media tried desperately to plaster over them with photo ops, handshakes, and flowery joint statements. The truth is, this relationship has always been an uneasy marriage of convenience, stitched together not by love or loyalty, but by self-interest. The cracks began to widen the moment Washington started assuming India would forever play the role of the junior partner. America wanted the perks of the partnership without ever treating India as an equal. From trade negotiations tilted in favor of US companies, to lectures on how India should behave on the world stage, the tone was unmistakable, patronizing, superior, and dripping with the arrogance of a country that still believed it alone wrote the rules. Washington's mistake was simple but fatal. It thought India would tolerate being told what to do indefinitely. India, however, is not the pliant nation of decades past. It is a rising giant, economically, militarily, diplomatically. It has its own ambitions, its own global vision, and its own fiercely independent streak. And when America tried to pull the same tired tricks, imposing conditions, dictating terms, demanding compliance, India finally began to push back. That pushback revealed just how fragile the so-called friendship really was. What Washington imagined was solid alliance turned out to be a house of cards, collapsing the moment India stopped nodding along. And let's not kid ourselves. These cracks weren't minor disagreements to be smoothed over with a press conference. They were deep, fundamental fractures in trust and respect. They exposed the simple reality that for years the US had been more interested in controlling India than cooperating with it. When India refused to bow, when it dared to act in its own interest rather than Washington's, the illusion shattered. The smiles at summits suddenly looked forced. The handshakes lost their warmth. Behind closed doors, frustration and resentment brewed on both sides. This is the uncomfortable truth no one in Washington wants to admit. America overplayed its hand. It assumed India's hunger for recognition and partnership would outweigh its pride and independence. But India wasn't desperate for validation. It was demanding respect. And when that respect wasn't given, the cracks became impossible to ignore. That's the story of this alliance. Not the glossy headlines, not the staged camaraderie, but the raw reality of two nations locked in a partnership that was always on shaky ground. One power unwilling to relinquish control, the other unwilling to be dictated to. And when that tension finally came to the surface, it didn't just dent the relationship, it revealed the entire foundation was flawed from the start. Every great shift in history can often be traced back to a single individual. Someone who refuses to play by the old rules, someone who doesn't just bend under pressure but digs their heels in and dares to challenge the status quo. In this story, the so-called unshakable bond between America and India wasn't unraveled by endless committees or long-winded diplomatic debates. It was rattled, exposed, and ultimately shaken by one man, one Indian who decided he wasn't going to be anyone's puppet. Think about it. For decades, Washington had become accustomed to foreign leaders nodding politely, swallowing their pride, and doing what was expected. That's how America maintained its influence, by setting the script and making sure others stuck to it. But when this Indian leader emerged, that comfortable routine was smashed to pieces. He didn't just walk into meetings with Washington, he walked in with the audacity to say, no. He looked across the table, saw the usual demands and pressure tactics, and refused to buckle. That single act of defiance was enough to send shockwaves through the relationship, because this wasn't just a polite disagreement over policy. This was a declaration, a blunt message that India wasn't going to be a silent sidekick anymore. It was going to stand tall, call out the hypocrisy, and chart its own path. For the United States, that was an unthinkable insult. For India, it was a moment of national pride, and for the world, it was proof that one person, standing firm, could shift the balance of power. What made it even more seismic was how this figure embodied something far larger than himself. He wasn't just another politician playing the usual game. He became a symbol of India's rising confidence, its refusal to be cornered, and its willingness to stare down the world's most powerful nation without flinching. The more Washington pushed, the more he resisted. The more they tried to twist his arm, the more he exposed the cracks in the so-called friendship. He wasn't being reckless, he was being real. And in doing so, he revealed just how lopsided the relationship had been all along. Now here's the irony: America thought it could silence him, marginalize him, perhaps even outmaneuver him on the global stage. But instead, every attempt to pressure him only made him stronger. Every clash became a headline, every standoff a symbol, every bold refusal a rallying cry for millions who were tired of seeing India treated like an afterthought. What began as one man's personal defiance turned into a national movement of confidence, a statement to the world that India would no longer play second fiddle. That's the story. One figure, standing against the grain, had the courage to do what so many others had been too afraid to attempt. He didn't just reject America's dominance, he shattered the illusion of equality in the relationship, and once that illusion was gone, nothing, not even years of diplomatic theater, could bring it back. If there's one thing history keeps teaching us, it's this: arrogance is the downfall of empires, and nowhere was that arrogance more blatant than in the way America miscalculated its relationship with India. For years, Washington operated under the smug belief that it held all the cards. It thought India, like so many others, would fall in line, smile for the cameras, and quietly comply behind closed doors. But that delusion was built on sand, and eventually the tide was bound to wash it away. The miscalculation was glaring. America believed its power was eternal and unquestionable. It assumed that by dangling promises of trade, security, and political support, it could keep India tethered like a loyal ally. What it didn't factor in was India's growing strength, its changing ambitions, and its refusal to be strong-armed into decisions that didn't serve its own national interests. Washington was stuck in the past, still treating India as if it were desperate for validation, when in reality India had already stepped into its own as a global player. And here's the real sting. America overplayed its hand. The tone it adopted was one of command rather than collaboration. Every negotiation felt less like a discussion between equals and more like a lecture from a schoolmaster scolding a student. But India wasn't having it. Instead of nodding politely, India pushed back. Instead of following the script, it rewrote it. And that's where Washington's miscalculation blew up in its face. Because once India stopped playing along, the entire charade of friendship collapsed. The more America tried to pressure India, the more it exposed its own weakness. Think about it. If you truly hold the upper hand, you don't need to beg, threaten, or coerce. But that's exactly what began happening. Washington's frustration grew louder, its tactics more desperate, its rhetoric more hollow. And the world could see it. The image of the unshakable superpower was cracking, and India was the one holding up the mirror. What makes this miscalculation so damning is that it wasn't just a tactical error. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of India itself. For all its intelligence agencies, analysts and advisors, America still failed to grasp one simple truth: India does not like being told what to do. It is a nation built on defiance, forged through resistance, and defined by its independence. Trying to control it was never going to work, yet Washington convinced itself otherwise, blinded by its own hubris. So, when the inevitable happened, when India finally said enough is enough, the shock in Washington was almost laughable. Officials scrambled, statements were watered down, and the mighty American swagger suddenly looked a lot more like a limp. The miscalculation had been exposed for the world to see. America wasn't untouchable, and India wasn't controllable. That's the uncomfortable truth. The so-called superpower believed it could dictate the terms forever, but it forgot the one rule of global politics: no nation, no matter how powerful, can survive on arrogance alone. And in the end, that arrogance became America's greatest weakness. What happened between these two nations didn't just stay confined to diplomatic corridors. It wasn't some private squabble hidden behind embassy doors. No, the aftershocks reverberated across the globe. The rupture in this so-called partnership triggered a ripple effect that reshaped not only the balance of power in Asia, but the very architecture of global politics. And the world was watching closely. For decades, the United States projected itself as the unrivaled conductor of world affairs. Allies followed, rivals bristled, and everyone else knew their place. But the moment India defied the script, the illusion of American omnipotence began to crumble. Other nations, some allies, some adversaries, sat up and took notice. If India could say no, if India could resist pressure, if India could hold its own against Washington without collapsing, then maybe they could too. That's when the ripple became a wave. Countries long wary of US dominance suddenly felt emboldened. They began rethinking old alliances, reconsidering trade agreements, recalibrating their loyalties. For the first time in years, there was proof that the world didn't have to orbit exclusively around Washington's demands. New alliances started forming, new conversations began, and suddenly, the geopolitical chessboard didn't look quite so one-sided. The myth of America as the unquestioned referee of global disputes was shattered, and India's defiance was the hammer that smashed it. And let's not downplay how significant this was for India itself. By standing its ground, it elevated its global stature overnight. Nations that once dismissed India as a secondary player now looked at it as a power with real leverage. Its voice carried more weight in international forums, its choices influenced more regions, and its example inspired others who were tired of being dictated to. What began as a clash with Washington evolved into a broader signal. The age of a unipolar world was fading fast. Of course, America tried to contain the fallout. It tried to downplay the cracks, insisting that the partnership was stronger than ever. But the world wasn't fooled. Every defensive press release, every desperate assurance only highlighted the truth. The balance of power was shifting. Nations in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and beyond began courting India, seeing in it a partner that could counterbalance Washington's dominance. This wasn't just a diplomatic rift. It was the start of a new global order, one where America's word no longer carried automatic authority. The ripple effect also exposed another reality. Washington's threats weren't as effective as they once were. Sanctions, diplomatic cold shoulders, economic warnings. All the old tricks were losing their sting. When India refused to fold under that pressure, others realized they didn't have to either. The fear was gone, and once fear disappears, control disappears with it. That's the real legacy of this moment. One clash, one act of defiance, sparked a chain reaction that spread across continents. The world saw that America could be challenged, that its grip could be loosened, and that new centers of power could rise. The ripple became a tide, and that tide is now reshaping the entire global order. When the dust finally settled, what remained wasn't some neatly packaged narrative of friendship or cooperation. What remained was the raw, uncomfortable truth. And that truth is this: the world is no longer one where America dictates the terms and everyone else simply nods along. India proved it. One act of defiance tore away the mask, and suddenly the illusion collapsed. For years, Washington wrapped its actions in the language of partnership, democracy, and shared values. It sold the world a story of equal allies, of a special bond destined to shape the century. But strip away the speeches and the reality was lopsided. America called the shots, expected compliance, and assumed gratitude. That was never a partnership, it was control masquerading as cooperation. And once India stopped playing along, that charade was exposed for the entire world to see. What makes this truth so explosive is that it can't be undone. You can repair relations, sign new agreements, and smile for the cameras, but once the world has seen the imbalance, it can't unsee it. And that's the situation Washington now faces. The myth of unshakable U.S. influence has been shattered, and India is the one that shattered it. That doesn't just damage America's standing with India. It undermines its image everywhere. Because let's be clear, this wasn't just about two countries falling out. This was about a broader shift in power. The moment India exposed the imbalance, it showed other nations what was possible. It showed them that the so-called superpower could be resisted, that arrogance could be challenged, and that respect could be demanded. That revelation is spreading faster than Washington can control, and it's already reshaping alliances across the globe. The uncomfortable truth is also a personal one for America. It has to face the fact that it is no longer untouchable. Its lectures ring hollow when its own democracy is fractured. Its threats carry less weight when others refuse to cower. Its promises sound less appealing when they're tied to conditions that strip away sovereignty. And now, thanks to one defiant stand, the world has proof. Proof that America can be challenged and even humbled. This is why the moment matters so much. It's not about diplomatic jargon or political spin, it's about perception. And perception shapes reality in global politics. The perception now is that America doesn't hold the same grip it once did. The perception now is that India is rising, and not as a follower but as an equal. And that perception, once formed, becomes impossible to erase. So here we are with the truth laid bare, not the polished, scripted version Washington wanted the world to believe, but the raw, unvarnished reality. America isn't untouchable, India isn't controllable, and the balance of power has shifted. One nation refused to bend. One leader refused to comply. And the truth America never wanted to admit, is finally out in the open. And once the truth is out, it cannot be silenced.